When the HOA banned my RV, I didn't fight back. I outsmarted them. I bought a decommissioned school bus, painted HOA Field Trip on the side, and parked it right in front of their office. But I had no idea. That one joke would turn the whole neighborhood into a battlefield. Call to action. Before we dive in, tell me, what country are you watching from? Drop your country's name in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. Frank Jenkins had spent his whole life working. Long hours, busted knuckles, and decades of saving every spare dollar. When he finally retired, he had one dream. Freedom. Not the kind of freedom where you sit on a porch and water your lawn. No, the kind where you could pack up, hit the road, and wake up anywhere you damn pleased. So he bought it, a shining silver RV. His ticket to peace. His retirement home on wheels. The first evening he parked it proudly in his driveway. The golden light hit the chrome just right. Frank smiled. Finally, he said to himself, sipping a cold beer. No more schedules. No more bosses. But the next morning the boss came anyway. Only she wasn't from work. She was from the Homeowners Association, Sarah Thompson. HOA president. 40-something, pencil skirt, clipboard, and that thin smile that could slice through glass. She stood in front of Frank's driveway like a sheriff at high noon. Frank stepped out, still in his robe, holding his coffee. "Morning, Sarah," he said casually. "Morning, Frank," she replied, flipping through her papers. "According to Section 8.3 of the Oakwood Estates Code, recreational vehicles are not permitted to be parked on any property for more than 24 hours. Frank blinked. "It's not a recreational vehicle, Sarah. It's my retirement dream." She gave him that patronizing look. "Dream or not, rules are rules. It needs to be gone by tonight, or we'll have it towed." Frank's jaw tightened. He smiled politely. "Noted," he said, and turned to go back inside. Behind the blinds, his eyes burned like a storm. You could practically hear the rebellious gears turning in his head. The next morning, the RV was gone. But Frank wasn't defeated. 3 days later, a strange rumble echoed through the neighborhood. Engines coughed, brakes squealed, and a massive yellow school bus rolled slowly down the street. Rust spots, dented sides, and a loud honking horn that made every bird scatter. Sarah Thompson froze on her porch, mouth half open. The bus parked in Frank's driveway, same spot as the RV. Frank stepped out, wearing sunglasses and a grin wide enough to stretch across the cul-de-sac. On the side of the bus, in bold red spray paint, were the words, HOA Field Trip. The neighborhood fell silent for 2 whole seconds. Then laughter broke out. A couple of teenagers took out their phones. Someone yelled, "You're insane, Frank!" Frank lit a cigarette. "Since they banned my RV," he said proudly, "I figured I'd go educational." Sarah's face turned crimson. She stomped toward him. "You can't be serious. This is vandalism. This is a violation of—" Frank cut her off. "Relax, Sarah. It's a school bus. You wouldn't dare ban education, would you?" The crowd laughed again. Sarah stormed back inside. Inside the bus, Frank had transformed it into a one-man paradise. There was a couch from the thrift store, Christmas lights hanging from the ceiling, a coffee maker buzzing in the corner, and a small TV playing old westerns. A handmade sign above the dashboard read, "Freedom is not a violation." At night, you could see the glow of fairy lights through the windows. Frank sat in the driver's seat sipping whiskey, country music playing low in the background. Whenever Sarah walked by, he'd wave cheerfully and shout, "Field trip's still open, Sarah! You're welcome to join." It drove her insane. Within a week, new HOA notices started appearing. No vehicles over 20 feet allowed. No unauthorized signage. No excessive noise after 8 p.m. Frank read each one, laughed, and found a loophole. He shortened the bus by removing the rear seats. He covered the spray paint with vinyl letters that technically weren't paint. And as for the noise, he bought noise-canceling headphones for himself. The man was unstoppable. Then came the weekend barbecue. Frank set up his grill on the bus roof. Smoke poured into the sky. People from down the block started bringing over burgers and beers. Kids called him Captain Frank. Someone played banjo music. It was chaos, the good kind. Sarah showed up, red-faced, holding her clipboard like a weapon. "This is not a community event. You can't host a party on top of a school bus." Frank raised his beer. "Relax, Sarah, it's not a party. It's a field trip orientation." The entire block burst into laughter. Sarah stormed away, muttering something about calling the board. That night, Frank didn't sleep. He sat in the bus, looking out the window. He saw lights in people's windows, the glow of families, kids playing, couples watching TV, and he thought, maybe it's not just about me. Maybe this is about all of them too. He wasn't just rebelling against HOA rules, he was rebelling against the suffocating sameness that had crept into their lives. Perfect lawns, perfect fences, perfect fake smiles. His bus, loud, messy, ridiculous, was the first real thing to happen on that street in years. The next evening, the HOA held an emergency meeting at the community center. Sarah slammed her gavel on the table. "He's mocking our community values," she shouted. One man raised his hand timidly. "Honestly, my kids love the bus," he said. "They've started calling him Field Trip Frank," another woman added. "At least he's not hurting anyone." Sarah glared. "This is a neighborhood, not a circus. If we let one man turn our rules into jokes, what's next? Chickens in the backyard?" A voice from the doorway interrupted her. "Already got 3 hens, Sarah." Everyone turned. Frank was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, a smirk on his face. The room fell silent for a beat, then burst into laughter. Sarah slammed the gavel again. "Frank, stop," but Frank just tipped his hat. "Not today, Madam President. Not today." Later that night, Frank climbed into the bus, turned on his mic, and his voice echoed through the quiet neighborhood. "Ladies and gentlemen of Oakwood Estates, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard the HOA Field Trip. Tonight we're going somewhere HOA can't reach, Freedom Land." The kids cheered from their windows. Even a few adults laughed quietly, shaking their heads. Sarah stood on her porch, arms folded, watching as the bus headlights flickered on. Frank saluted her with 2 fingers, shifted gears, and said softly, "Trip starts now." The bus rolled slowly down the street, fairy lights twinkling in the dark, exhaust smoke curling into the night. Behind him, the neat, perfect homes of Oakwood Estates faded away, and for the first time in years, Frank Jenkins felt alive. Frank Jenkins had always considered himself a simple man. He liked his coffee black, his grass slightly overgrown, and his music loud enough to annoy the neighbors. But as his bus rumbled out of Oakwood Estates that night, fairy lights swinging inside and the faint sound of Johnny Cash playing on the speakers, he felt something deeper, something wild and alive that he hadn't felt since he was young. He didn't know it then, but this night, this ridiculous act of defiance was going to make him a legend. The morning after, by sunrise, Oakwood Estates was buzzing. Word spread like wildfire through the neighborhood group chat. "Did you see Frank last night? He actually drove that bus out of the community. Sarah's losing her mind!" And she was. Sarah Thompson hadn't slept a wink. Her dining table was covered with HOA policy printouts, highlighted sections, and sticky notes labeled violations, fines, and legal action. Her husband, Dan, poured himself coffee and mumbled, "Honey, maybe just let the man have his bus." Sarah glared at him like he'd just confessed to arson. "Let him have his bus? Dan, if we don't stop him, this neighborhood falls apart. One man breaks the rules, everyone breaks the rules." She stormed out the door, clipboard in hand. Meanwhile, Frank's bus was parked at a nearby lake, quiet, peaceful, surrounded by pine trees. He sat in a folding chair, fishing line in the water, the morning sun reflecting off the yellow paint of the bus. On the side, the red letters still screamed, "HOA Field Trip." He smiled to himself. Damn right it is. The bus door creaked open and out hopped 3 local kids, the ones who had snuck out to join him the night before. They called themselves the Field Trip Crew. There was Max, a 13-year-old with a GoPro, Ella, a quiet girl with pink headphones, and Tyler, who was obsessed with taking drone shots of everything. "Mr. Jenkins," Max shouted. "You're trending on TikTok." Frank blinked. "On what now?" Tyler flipped his phone around, a video of the bus leaving the neighborhood, with the caption, "When HOA bans your RV, so you build a school bus rebellion. HO Field Trip." Hundreds of thousands of views. Comments pouring in. People loved it. "This man's my hero. We all need a Frank in our neighborhood. HOA Field Trip merch when?" Frank just laughed. "Guess I'm famous now, huh?" HOA retaliation back at Oakwood Estates. Sarah called an emergency HOA board meeting. All 8 members sat around the long oak table, nervously sipping bottled water as Sarah paced like a general before battle. "He's mocking the foundation of our community," she snapped. "He's not mocking, he's marketing," said Tom, the treasurer. "We've gotten 4 property inquiries since that video went viral." Sarah froze. "You're saying people like this?" Tom shrugged. "Apparently, folks think Oakwood Estates is fun now." Her eyes widened in horror. "Fun? We are not fun. We are orderly!" But it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. By that evening, local news vans were parked near the neighborhood entrance. A reporter spoke into her mic. "It started as a small dispute between a retired resident and his HOA. Now, it's a national conversation about freedom, community, and one man's legendary bus." Behind her, the sign Oakwood Estates looked suddenly ironic. Frank returns. When Frank finally drove the bus back into the neighborhood, the crowd waiting for him was something out of a movie. Kids waved signs that read, "Honk for Freedom." "Field Trip Frank 2025. Even a few adults were holding coffee mugs and cheering. Frank leaned out the window and yelled, "Morning, folks! The field trip's back on schedule." The bus horn blared. Everyone laughed, except one person. Sarah Thompson stood in the middle of the street, blocking his path like a traffic cop. Frank hit the brakes and sighed. "Sarah, move before I make you a hood ornament." "You've gone too far this time," she said, clipboard trembling in her hand. "You've broken at least 9 community bylaws. You've made a mockery of everything this neighborhood stands for." Frank leaned his elbow on the windowsill. "What does this neighborhood even stand for, Sarah? Matching mailboxes and fear." For a moment, her face softened. Then it hardened again. "You're done, Frank. The board has voted to fine you $10,000 and revoke your residency privileges." Frank stared at her for a long moment. Then he smiled. "You think you can find freedom?" He opened the bus door, stepped down, and walked right up to her. The crowd hushed. "You know what your problem is, Sarah? You confuse control with community. People aren't supposed to live scared of their own neighborhood." He gestured toward the crowd. Real people, smiling, laughing, holding kids. "Look around. For once, everyone's actually talking to each other. Nobody cared about this place until I rolled up with that bus." Sarah's jaw trembled, but she said nothing. Frank turned, climbed back into the bus, and fired up the engine. "If you want to stop me, you'll have to catch me on the next field trip." The crowd erupted in applause as the bus roared down the street once more. The storm, but the next week, things got serious. Sarah hired a private attorney. Legal letters were mailed. The HOA issued formal violation notices. Police cruisers even parked nearby, not to arrest Frank, but to observe. The local news covered it daily now. Some saw Frank as a hero. Others called him a menace, but Frank? He just kept rolling. He started hosting Open Bus Fridays, where anyone could climb aboard, eat BBQ, and talk about life without HOA rules. Musicians came, artists painted, kids laughed. It became a movement, and one night, under the fairy lights strung across the bus yard, Frank looked at the growing crowd and said, "They can write all the rules they want, but they can't regulate living." Cheers. Clapping. Someone even handed him a shirt that said, "Field Trip Frank, Free-Range Human, the breaking point." A week later, disaster struck. At 3:14 a.m., flashing lights flooded the street. A tow truck hired by the HOA had hooked up to Frank's bus. He rushed out in his slippers, shouting, "Hey! You touch that bus and I'll—" The officer stepped forward. "Sir, calm down. The HOA has filed for property removal due to code violation." Sarah stood there too, arms crossed, her expression tight, not triumphant, just tired. "Frank," she said softly, "it's over." The neighborhood woke up. Dozens of people stood outside watching as the tow truck began pulling the bus away. The kids cried. The fairy lights flickered in the dark. Frank stood frozen, jaw clenched, eyes glistening. When the bus disappeared around the corner, the street felt hollow. 2 weeks later, Frank's yard was empty now. Just grass, quiet and still. The HOA had declared victory. New signs appeared. Oakwood Estates, a peaceful community, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt sterile. People barely spoke. The laughter was gone. The Friday nights were silent again. And Sarah? She noticed it too. Every evening, she'd pass by Frank's empty driveway, clipboard in hand, and feel something she couldn't name. One night, she stopped. She looked at the patch of dirt where the bus tires had been, and she whispered to herself, maybe he wasn't entirely wrong. The return a month later, on a warm Saturday morning, a familiar sound echoed through the streets. Hun-kick people rushed outside. Sarah froze mid-step. Down the road came a shiny new bus, same model, but this time clean, painted blue and white. On the side, in neat professional lettering, it said, HOA Field Trip, Community Outreach Bus. The crowd cheered. Frank stepped out wearing a captain's hat and sunglasses. Sarah walked up, half in disbelief. "Frank, what is this?" He grinned. "Partnership, sweetheart. The city loved my idea. They gave me a permit. Official outreach project. I'm taking seniors, kids, and vets on free trips every weekend. The HOA can't touch it." Sarah stared at him. Then, to everyone's shock, she started laughing. Real laughter. "You stubborn old man." "Takes one to know one," Frank said, tipping his hat. The final field trip that afternoon, half the neighborhood gathered around the new bus. Families, kids, even Sarah and her husband climbed aboard. Frank stood at the front, holding a small mic. The same mic from the old bus. "Ladies and gentlemen of Oakwood Estates," he said, voice warm and steady. "Welcome aboard your first official HOA field trip. Today, we're going somewhere without rules, without complaints, and definitely without clipboards." Laughter filled the bus. Sarah rolled her eyes but smiled. Frank started the engine, and as the bus rolled down the hill, sunlight spilling across the street, he glanced at the rearview mirror. The people who once looked away from each other were now laughing together. And Sarah, sitting near the front, gave him a small, genuine smile. He nodded back. Epilogue. Months later, a small sign appeared near the Oakwood Estates entrance. It read, "Community where freedom and respect ride together." Right below it, in tiny print, was a smaller plaque, dedicated to Frank Field Trip Jenkins, who reminded us all what it means to live free. And every Sunday morning, if you listened closely, you could still hear it, the faint hum of a bus engine somewhere down the road, followed by the echo of laughter and a familiar voice on the speaker saying, "This is your captain speaking. Next stop, Freedom Land."